The champagne was lukewarm, just like the praise I had been receiving for the past 6 months. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, adjusting a tie I had bought specifically for this night. Around me, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and corporate desperation. This was the Chairman's Circle Gala, the kind of event where the lighting is dimmed just enough to hide the exhaustion on everyone's faces. I didn't mind the exhaustion. Project Phoenix had been my life for 18 months. I had missed birthdays, skipped vacations, and worked until my eyes burned under fluorescent lights to ensure its success. The math was simple. The project saved the company $8 million in overhead. My contract stipulated a performance bonus of exactly $100,000 upon completion. I wasn't being greedy. I was being paid what I had earned. Rick, my manager, was hovering near the stage. He looked polished in a way that felt oily. For months, he had been telling me to keep my head down and focus on the technical delivery while he handled the politics. I believed him because I wanted to believe that hard work actually mattered in a place like this. I had spent countless nights fixing his sloppy projections and rewriting his incoherent memos just to keep the project on track. I viewed it as an investment in our shared success. I thought we were a partnership. When the CEO took the podium, the room fell silent. He started talking about innovation and resilience. He mentioned Project Phoenix as the crown jewel of the fiscal year. My heart started hammering against my ribs. This was the moment. The CEO invited Rick onto the stage to accept the trophy for excellence in leadership. I felt a small sting of disappointment that I wasn't called up, but I pushed it down. Rick took the microphone, flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and began his speech. He talked about the immense pressure of guiding a team through such a complex transition. He used the word we a lot, but he used the word I even more. He spoke about his vision and his strategic pivots. Then came the blow that knocked the wind out of me. He announced that because of the success of Phoenix, the board had decided to appoint him as the new senior vice president of operations. The room erupted in applause. I stood there, frozen, waiting for him to mention the bonus pool, or the lead architect who actually built the system. He didn't. He just waved the trophy and stepped down. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced smiles and backslapping. I finally caught Rick near the bar as people were starting to filter out. He was holding a glass of scotch that cost more than my first car. I asked him, as calmly as I could, when the bonus disbursements would be finalized. I told him I hadn't seen the notification in my internal portal. Rick didn't even look me in the eye at first. He took a slow sip of his drink, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the peat on his breath. He told me there had been a slight clerical error with my specific payout. He said the budget for the Project Phoenix bonuses had been restructured at the last minute to accommodate the administrative costs of the new leadership transition. He actually had the nerve to pat my shoulder. He told me that money comes and goes, but the prestige of being on a winning team lasts forever. Then he said the words that turned my blood into ice. He told me I was a team player, and that I shouldn't let a little paperwork glitch ruin my night. He suggested I take a long weekend to clear my head, and come back Monday ready to support his new vision for the department. He walked away to join a circle of executives, leaving me standing under a spotlight that felt like an interrogation lamp. I realized then that my generosity with my time and my talent had been mistaken for weakness. I had spent years making him look like a genius, and he had rewarded me by stealing my future. I didn't stay for dessert. I walked out of that ballroom, handed my valet ticket to the attendant, and drove home in a silence so heavy it felt physical. I went home and checked my contract. That's when I realized the clerical error wasn't an accident. It was a signature. The Monday morning air in the office felt different. It was heavy, filtered through the lens of a weekend spent staring at a contract that now felt like a death warrant. I sat at my desk and watched Rick walk past my glass partition. He was wearing a new watch, a gold piece that probably cost a significant chunk of my missing bonus. He flashed a thumbs up as if the gala conversation had been a pleasant exchange about the weather. I remembered how it started 3 years ago. Rick had positioned himself as the mentor I never had. He told me he saw a younger version of himself in my work ethic. He said he wanted to shield me from the corporate vultures, so I could focus on being a visionary. I felt honored. I felt seen. In reality, he was just building a shield for his own incompetence. Every time a deadline loomed, Rick would come to my office with a weary sigh, complaining about the board's impossible demands. He'd ask if I could take a quick look at his deck or polish his financial models. A quick look always turned into a 12-hour shift. I did it gladly because I thought I was paying my dues. I thought the sweat equity I was pouring into his reputation would eventually flow back to me. I was the ghost in the machine, the silent engine keeping his career from stalling out. I treated his success as my own, never realizing I was just providing him with a higher vantage point from which to look down on me. I finally walked into his new, larger office for our scheduled one-on-one. The smell of expensive leather and fresh lilies was sickening. I didn't sit down. The following Saturday, I didn't go for my usual run. I didn't get coffee with friends. I sat in my home office with the blinds drawn, the blue light of 3 monitors reflecting off my glasses. If Rick wanted to play a game of technicalities and clerical errors, I was more than happy to provide the dataset. I began by opening my private archive of JIRA tickets and version histories. In the corporate world, people forget that digital footprints are permanent. They think an email sent is an email gone, but the servers remember everything. I started pulling every log from the last 3 years, focusing specifically on the Project Phoenix timeline. I wanted to see exactly how my work transitioned from my hard drive to the board's eyes. What I found was a masterclass in systematic erasure. I started comparing my sent drafts to the final reports archived in the company's executive portal. It was surgical. Rick had been taking my comprehensive technical audits and strategic forecasts, stripping my name from the header, and replacing it with his own. But he wasn't just changing the name. He was subtly tweaking the language to make it sound like he was directing my every move. In my original drafts, I would write, "I have implemented a new caching layer to reduce latency." In the versions he sent to the board, it became, "I directed the team to implement a caching layer under my strict supervision to ensure we hit our targets." He was ghost-authoring my entire professional identity, transforming my solo victories into his managerial triumphs. I moved on to the time-stamped logs. This was where the saint versus monster narrative became a matter of cold, hard evidence. I found dozens of instances where Rick had checked into high-end golf resorts or leadership retreats, on days when he had supposedly been in the trenches with me. On the night of the massive server migration in October, he had sent an email to the CEO at 2 a.m. claiming he was still in the war room with the boys. I checked the metadata on that email. It was sent from an iPhone in the Hamptons. Meanwhile, my own logs showed me logged into the terminal for 14 consecutive hours, resolving line after line of broken code, while he was likely 3 martinis deep at a coastal bar. I felt a strange, detached sense of clarity. The gaslighting he had put me through in his office, the idea that I was just a team player, who should be grateful for a seat at the table, was a necessary lie for him. If I ever realized that he was essentially a parasitic organism living off my output, his entire house of cards would collapse. I started building a master spreadsheet. I labeled it the audit. In the first tab, I linked every original document to its plagiarized counterpart. I hyperlinked the commit histories that proved I was the sole author of the codebase that saved the company millions. I was documenting the theft of my intellectual labor, dollar by dollar, hour by hour. I worked through the night, fueled by a mix of caffeine and a growing, righteous fury. I had been so generous with my knowledge because I thought excellence was a rising tide that lifted all boats. I didn't realize Rick was a hole in the hull. I spent hours cross-referencing his leadership meetings with my own calendar invites. He had been double-billing his time, claiming to be mentoring me while actually being completely unreachable. I had the receipts. I had the logs. I had a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to his new mahogany desk. I had enough to prove he was a fraud in terms of performance, and that alone would have been enough to rattle his new promotion. But the deeper I dug into the metadata, the more I realized Rick wasn't just stealing credit. He was stealing from the company's expense fund too. I walked into the office on Monday morning with a terrifying sense of calm. For 3 years, I had arrived at 7 a.m. to prep Rick's briefings, troubleshoot his errors, and anticipate every crisis before it reached his desk. I was his peripheral vision, his memory, and his hands. But today, I did something radical. I sat down, opened my official job description, and read it line by line. Nowhere did it say I was responsible for his quarterly projections. Nowhere did it say I was the administrator for the Phoenix Legacy database. My contract said I was a senior systems architect. So, I decided to finally be one. I made myself a coffee and spent the morning refactoring a minor block of code that had been sitting on my backlog. At 10 a.m., my Slack started pinging. It was Rick. He needed the executive summary for the Q3 forecast, a document I usually had finished by Sunday night as a courtesy. I didn't reply. At 11 a.m., he called my desk. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't being rude. I was simply occupied with the technical tasks listed in my actual role. By midday, the office atmosphere began to shift. The managerial overlap I had provided was the only thing holding the department's facade together. And without it, the cracks were becoming visible to everyone. The fraying started in the afternoon. The finance department called Rick's line, asking for the master credentials to the projection software. Since I had built the environment, I held the root access. Rick, who had told the board he oversaw the architecture, didn't even know the difference between an API key and a password. He couldn't log in. He couldn't even explain why he couldn't log in. I watched through my glass wall as he paced his office, his face turning a mottled shade of red. He was realizing that the team he led was actually just a man he had insulted, and that man was currently busy documenting server latency. The explosion happened at 3 p.m. in the break room. I was refilling my water bottle when the heavy door swung open so hard it hit the rubber stopper with a crack. Rick stormed in, his tie loosened and his expensive watch gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. There were 3 other co-workers there, Sarah from marketing and 2 junior devs. Rick didn't care about the witnesses. He started screaming before the door even settled. He demanded to know where the projections were. He accused me of sabotaging his first week as senior VP. He shouted that he had given me everything, that he had mentored me, and that this petty tantrum over a bonus was proving exactly why I wasn't ready for a promotion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stop filling my bottle. I waited for him to run out of breath, for the silence to get uncomfortably long. Then I looked him dead in the eye and told him that per my job description, those projections fell under his direct responsibilities as the department lead. I told him that if he had forgotten the login credentials I had emailed him 6 months ago, he should contact IT and open a formal ticket. I reminded him, in front of the stunned juniors, that he had told the chairman he personally managed the Phoenix data integrity. If that was true, he shouldn't need my help to find the submit button. Rick's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to lunge at me, but the presence of the others held him back. He hissed that I was making a massive mistake, and that he would see to it that I never worked in this city again. He called me ungrateful. He called me a clerical error that he was going to fix. He stormed out, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. My co-workers looked at me with a mix of awe and terror. They had seen the mask slip. They had seen the leader turn into a playground bully because he couldn't do the work he was being paid 3 times my salary to oversee. I finished my water and went back to my desk. The first cut had been made, and the wound was deep. That's when HR's anonymous tip line received its first piece of evidence. The office environment didn't just turn cold, it turned clinical. By Tuesday morning, the whispers were no longer about the project or the missing bonus. They were about my state of mind. Rick was a seasoned veteran in the art of the preemptive strike, and he knew that the best way to discredit a whistleblower is to make them look like they've lost their grip on reality. I watched him from a distance as he moved from cubicle to cubicle, his hand on people's shoulders, his voice dropped to a low, performative whisper of concern. He was playing the role of the heartbroken mentor, a man forced to deal with a star employee who was tragically cracking under the pressure. I started noticing the changes in how people interacted with me almost immediately. When I walked into the kitchenette, conversations would stop mid-sentence. People who had worked alongside me for years suddenly found their phone screens incredibly fascinating the moment our eyes met. Sarah from marketing, who I'd helped with her own performance review data just a month prior, wouldn't even look at me. I heard a rumor through a sympathetic junior dev that Rick had told the executive floor I was exhibiting erratic behavior, and that he was worried about my stability in a high-security environment. It was a calculated, vicious move. By framing my refusal to do his work as a mental health crisis, he was building a narrative where any evidence I brought forward would be dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled, broken person. The isolation was a physical weight. I would sit at my desk, perfectly capable, perfectly sane, and watch the world move around me like I was a ghost. At lunch, the table I usually sat at would magically clear within minutes of my arrival. I heard the word unstable floated in the hallway. I heard someone mention burnout. Rick was even so bold as to send me an email, CCNGHR, suggesting that I take advantage of the company's employee assistance program for my obvious emotional distress. It was the ultimate insult. He was using the very systems meant to protect employees as a weapon to bury me. He wanted to make me so toxic that even if I did present the audit, people would just shake their heads and say it was part of my episode. Every time I tried to speak up in a meeting, Rick would interrupt with a soft, condescending tone. "Let's give you a rest on this one," he'd say, smiling at the other managers. "I think we all know you've been under a lot of strain lately." The other managers would nod, their eyes full of a pity that felt like a slap in the face. I was being erased in real time. My years of dedication, my late nights, my technical genius. It was all being rewritten as the lead-up to a nervous breakdown. I felt my resolve beginning to crumble. It's one thing to fight a villain, it's another thing to fight a ghost story. I began to wonder if I should just take the loss, sign a severance agreement, and disappear. The psychological toll of being treated like a ticking time bomb by people I respected was almost too much to bear. I stayed late one evening, not to work, but because I didn't want to face the silence of my own apartment. I sat in the dark office, watching the city lights, feeling the crushing weight of the smear campaign. I had the spreadsheet. I had the logs. But who would believe a broken man? I felt the urge to just delete the files, walk out, and never look back. My finger was hovering over the trash icon on the audit folder. I felt defeated. I felt like the monster had finally won by convincing the world I was the one with the claws. The gaslighting was working. I was almost ready to quit. I had my resignation letter drafted, a short, defeated note that gave Rick exactly what he wanted. My silence and my departure. I was about to hit send, to let the $100,000 go and let the 3 years of theft be the price of my escape. I was tired of being the pariah. I was tired of the pitying looks and the whispered warnings in the break room. My hand was shaking as I moved the cursor toward the send button, ready to end the nightmare once and for all. Just as the cursor hovered over the finality of my surrender, my phone buzzed on the desk. A notification popped up from an app one rarely checked after hours. It was a LinkedIn message from a name I hadn't thought about in over a year. It was from Rick's ex-assistant, a woman named Maya who had vanished from the company under mysterious circumstances, right before I took over the Phoenix lead. Maya's message was a lifeline, but it was also a warning. She didn't say much, only that she had seen my name on a project report and felt a pang of guilt for not speaking up sooner. She told me to look at the miscellaneous expense codes for the Phoenix development phase. That was the spark I needed. I closed my resignation draft and opened the accounting portal with a renewed, cold focus. If Rick wanted to paint me as a man who had lost his mind, I was going to show him exactly how much a focused mind could uncover. I began the second phase of the audit, and this time, I wasn't just looking for stolen credit. I was looking for the money. I spent the next 6 hours building what would become the most important document of my career. I created a master spreadsheet that was a surgical breakdown of value versus theft. On the first tab, I calculated the return on investment. I pulled the raw data from the Phoenix launch, the server cost reductions, the automated legacy migrations, and the salvaged contracts. I mapped my specific code commits to the company's quarterly savings. The final number was staggering. My clerical error of a project had generated $12 million in pure, bottom-line ROI within the first 12 months. Against that, my promised $100,000 bonus wasn't just a reward, it was a bargain. I was a profit center, and Rick was treating me like a liability. The second tab was where the cold burn became a wildfire. I followed Maya's lead into the expense codes. As the lead architect, I had oversight on the project budget, but Rick had always insisted on handling the final filing to save me the administrative headache. Now I saw why. I started cross-referencing the $45,000 in miscellaneous charges Rick had billed to Project Phoenix. He had been clever, burying small amounts under vague labels like consultant research or vendor strategy. But when I pulled the vendor IDs, the truth was pathetic. One vendor was a high-end furniture boutique in the city. Another was a luxury catering service that had provided a private anniversary dinner for Rick and his wife, billed entirely to my server migration budget as late-night team support. He had even billed a 3-day weekend at a vineyard as a technical architecture summit. Every time I had been in the office eating cold pizza and staring at a debugger, Rick had been using my project's budget to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own. He wasn't just stealing my work. He was treating my sweat and blood as his personal ATM. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I filled in the cells of the spreadsheet. Each row was a receipt, a timestamp, and a betrayal. I calculated the interest on the stolen funds. I calculated the tax implications of his fraudulent filings. I created a visual dashboard that showed the exact moment he started offloading his work onto me and the corresponding spike in his personal expense claims. It was a perfect inverse correlation. As my productivity went up, his leadership expenses followed suit. He was a parasite in a bespoke suit, and I finally had the microscopic evidence to prove it. I didn't stop at the finances. I incorporated the metadata from Phase 1, linking the fraudulent expenses to the days he had claimed to be working alongside me. I included the Slack logs where he had specifically told me there was no budget for a junior developer to help me, while on the same day, he had spent $2,000 of that same budget on executive networking at a steakhouse. The contrast was nauseating. I was a team player who had to beg for a new monitor, while he was the leader who used our project funds to buy gifts for his mistress or his wife. At this point, I didn't even care which. By 4 a.m., the spreadsheet was a masterpiece of corporate ruin. It was 3 years of my life distilled into a series of undeniable, devastating figures. It was the audit of entitlement. I stood up from my desk and looked at the final tally. Rick owed the company over $45,000 in direct theft, and he owed me a career's worth of dignity. He had spent weeks trying to make the office believe I was a mental health risk, because he was terrified I would do exactly what I had just finished doing. He knew that if I ever looked at the numbers, his entire world would go up in smoke. I knew that taking this to HR was a gamble. Rick had spent weeks poisoning that well, and they would likely view my spreadsheet as the manifesto of a disgruntled employee. I needed someone whose loyalty wasn't to culture or teamwork, but to the bottom line. I needed someone who viewed a $45,000 theft as a personal insult. I saved the file as a password-protected PDF and composed a short, professional email. I didn't send the file to Rick. I sent it to the one person Rick was terrified of, the chief financial officer. The office was unusually quiet on Wednesday morning, the kind of stillness that precedes a controlled demolition. I had sent the email to the CFO at 5 a.m., along with a courtesy copy to the Internal Audit Committee. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. Rick didn't come to my desk. He sent a calendar invite for an urgent performance alignment in Conference Room B. It was the room at the end of the hall, the one with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that faced the entire open-plan office. He wanted an audience for my execution. He wanted everyone to see the pariah being handled. I walked into the room and didn't sit down. I placed my laptop on the mahogany table and dialed into the prearranged Zoom link I'd received from the CFO's executive assistant 10 minutes prior. I muted the audio on the laptop but kept the microphone active on my phone, which I tucked into my breast pocket, the lens peeking out just enough. Rick stormed in a moment later, slamming the glass door so hard it vibrated in its frame. He didn't have his usual polish. His tie was crooked, and there was a frantic, wild energy in his eyes that told me he'd already received a very confusing phone call from the finance department. He didn't start with questions. He started with fire. He stood less than 2 feet from me, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. He began by calling me a backstabbing snake. He told me that my little spreadsheet was a work of fiction created by a failing mind. He screamed that I was a mid-level nobody who should have stayed in my lane. He told me that he had spent 3 years protecting me from the consequences of my own social incompetence, and this was how I repaid him. He was shouting so loud that people at their desks outside were stopping to stare. This was exactly what he wanted, to humiliate me publicly one last time to validate his unstable employee narrative. I remained silent, which only infuriated him further. He leaned over the table, his spit hitting the polished wood. He told me that I was worthless to the company. He said that he had built Project Phoenix, and that I was just a glorified typist who followed his instructions. Then he moved in closer, lowering his voice to a hiss that was somehow more violent than the screaming. He told me that he owned my career. He said he would make sure that every recruiter in the industry knew I was a litigious, mentally ill liability. He told me he would personally see to it that I never earned another dollar in this sector. "You think you're a hero?" he sneered, gesturing to the glass walls and the watching office. "You're a clerical error I'm finally deleting. I am this department. You are nothing." He went on for 5 more minutes, a vitriolic monologue of every insecurity he had projected onto me. He admitted in his rage that he had used the project funds for his leadership expenses, because he earned the right to live like a king for managing a drone like me. He laughed when he mentioned the bonus, telling me he had already spent my $100,000 on a down payment for a vacation home. He felt invincible. He thought he was in a private room with a victim he had already broken. He was so consumed by his own sense of entitlement that he failed to notice the glowing green light on my laptop camera, or the fact that the CFO, the CEO, and 3 members of the board of directors were currently watching his career disintegrate in high definition. I looked past him at the glass wall. My co-workers weren't looking away in pity anymore. They were looking at him with horror. I looked back at Rick and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally finished a very long, very difficult audit. I reached down and unmuted the laptop speakers. The room went dead silent. Then a voice from the laptop spoke. "Rick, please step away from the desk." The silence that followed the CFO's voice was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Rick froze, his hand still midair from a frantic gesture of dominance. His face drained of color so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug at his feet. He looked at the laptop screen, seeing the grid of stony-faced executives, and then back at me. I didn't say a word. I just picked up my phone and ended the call. The glass door opened, but it wasn't HR this time. It was a pair of stone-faced men in dark suits followed by the company's general counsel. They didn't even look at me. They looked at Rick. Within an hour, the office was no longer a workplace. It was a crime scene. A third-party forensic audit firm arrived, and they didn't waste time with corporate pleasantries. They set up in the main conference room and began a systematic sweep of Rick's digital and physical files. The legal team started conducting interviews, and for the first time in 3 years, the truth wasn't filtered through Rick's ego. They called Sarah from marketing. They called the junior devs. They called the assistants who had seen Rick disappear for 3-hour lunches while I worked through my breaks. The pariah status I had been carrying like a lead weight vanished almost instantly. As my coworkers filed out of their interviews, the looks of pity were replaced by a profound, collective realization. They hadn't been avoiding an unstable colleague. They had been witnessing a slow-motion robbery. Sarah came to my desk later that afternoon, her eyes red. She told me the auditors had shown her the expense logs, the luxury dinners Rick had billed, while telling her there was no budget for her team's software renewals. The juniors realized the mentorship Rick had boasted about was actually a systematic theft of their intellectual property. The monster wasn't just my problem anymore. He was a parasite who had been feeding on the entire department's potential. I watched from my desk as the final act played out. The auditors found the missing $45,000 within 90 minutes. It wasn't even buried that deep. Rick had become so arrogant that he'd stopped trying to hide the receipts, assuming no one would ever dare to look. They found the offshore server logs proving he hadn't logged into the Project Phoenix environment in over 4 months, despite his claims of hands-on leadership. The board didn't even wait for a formal report. The general counsel emerged from the room and walked straight to Rick's office. The office went silent as 2 security guards stood at his door. They didn't give him the dignity of a box for his things. They handed him his coat and his car keys. Rick tried to maintain a shred of his old persona, attempting to puff out his chest as he was led through the bullpen. But the mask was shattered. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a fraud caught in the light. As he passed my desk, he tried to catch my eye, perhaps looking for a spark of the old team player who would bail him out. I didn't look up from my monitor. I was busy drafting the transition plan for the new interim leadership. I heard the elevator chime, and then he was gone. My coworkers didn't cheer. They just went back to work with a sense of relief that felt like a long overdue exhale. Rick thought being fired was the end of it. He had no idea I'd already filed the civil suit. The passage of time has a way of turning a cold burn into a permanent scar. 6 months have passed since the security guards escorted Rick out of the building, and the transformation of the office, and my life, is total. I am now sitting in the office that used to be his, though I've replaced the lilies with plants that actually require care to grow, and the smell of expensive, stolen scotch has been replaced by the scent of hard work and transparency. I was named the acting department head within weeks of the investigation's conclusion. The board didn't have much choice. Once the forensic auditors finished their report, it became clear that I was the only person who actually knew how the company's primary revenue driver functioned. The fallout for Rick was not the quick, clean break he had hoped for. The company didn't just fire him. They went after him with a corporate ferocity that only comes when wealthy people realize they've been swindled. They initiated a clawback provision on his entire compensation package for the final year. The $100,000 bonus he had bragged about, the money he had already put down on a vacation home, was legally reclaimed. Since he had already spent the cash, he was forced to liquidate his assets. The luxury watch, the designer suits, and eventually that vacation home were all stripped away. But the most devastating blow didn't come from the board. It came from his own house. Rick's wife, who had been his willing partner in the Saint versus Monster narrative, didn't stay to weather the storm. Through the grapevine, I learned that she had been perfectly happy to enjoy the lifestyle upgrades my work had provided, but she had no interest in being married to a man who was now legally toxic and financially ruined. She filed for divorce 3 months ago, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew the difference was simply the lack of a 6-figure slush fund. Rick had spent years building a life out of stolen parts, and without my labor to hold it together, the entire structure collapsed into a pile of legal fees and loneliness. I, on the other hand, received the full $100,000 bonus, plus a significant retention kicker, and back pay for the overtime hours I had documented in the audit. The money is nice, but the real victory is the silence. There is no more gaslighting. There are no more whispers about my stability. The team I now lead operates on a foundation of the audit. Every success is tracked to the person who actually earned it. The juniors are thriving because I give them the credit Rick used to steal. We are more productive than ever because the parasite has been removed, and the host is finally allowed to breathe. I thought I had seen the last of him until yesterday morning. I was clearing out my junk folder when I saw a name that made my pulse skip for a fraction of a second. It was an email from a private account. It was Rick. The tone was unrecognizable. There was no screaming, no threats, and no talk of owning my career. He sounded hollow. He told me that he had been blacklisted from every major firm in the city. He mentioned that his bank accounts were frozen due to the ongoing litigation with the company, and that he was facing a massive tax bill for the fraudulent expenses he'd claimed. Then came the desperation. He asked me, as a former colleague and friend, if I could provide him with a professional reference. He said he was interviewing for a junior management role at a mid-sized logistics firm out of state, a job that was several steps below the position he held 10 years ago. He claimed he had learned his lesson, and just needed a win to get back on his feet and pay for his legal defense. He actually had the audacity to suggest that since I was now in his old chair, I owed my success to the opportunities he had provided me. Even in the dirt, he was trying to find a way to make my achievements his fault. I stared at the email for a long time. I thought about the night of the gala. I thought about the clerical error, and the way he looked at me in that glass conference room when he told me I was nothing. I thought about the hundreds of hours of my life he had stolen to buy a watch he no longer owns. I realized that the greatest mercy I could show him was the same thing he gave me. the absolute unvarnished truth. I didn't ignore him. I didn't send a scathing reply. I did give him a reference. I sent his new employer the link to the public court records. The sun filtered through the blinds of my new office, casting long, steady lines across a desk that I actually earned. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after a war has ended, especially one fought with spreadsheets and metadata instead of raised voices. My bank account reflects a balance that finally matches my worth. The $100,000 bonus arrived 3 months ago, but the company didn't stop there. The CFO personally authorized an additional loyalty kicker and a retroactive interest payment to cover the months Rick spent sitting on my money. It wasn't just a payout, it was a formal admission of my value. I spend my mornings now ensuring that no one under my leadership ever feels the way I did. We have a culture of receipts here. When a junior developer stays late to fix a bug, their name is the only one on the success report. When a project saves the company money, the people who wrote the code are the ones who get the trophies. I've realized that power doesn't have to be parasitic. A real leader is a conduit for their team's brilliance, not a filter that catches all the gold for themselves. I look at the empty space on the wall where Rick used to keep his Leadership Excellence awards, and I feel nothing but a profound sense of peace. The moral of this entire ordeal is something I carry with me every day. People like Rick will always try to convince you that you are replaceable, unstable, or small. They do this because they are terrified that if you ever look up, you'll see how far above them you actually are. They need you to be small so they can feel tall. But numbers don't lie, and neither does the truth. Don't ever let someone make you feel small just because they can't reach your height. If you provide the value, you hold the power. You just have to be brave enough to audit the life you're living. I'm closing my laptop now, ready to head home to a life that is finally mine. I thought Rick was the ultimate test of my resolve, but looking back, he was just a warm-up for the real betrayal that was waiting for me at home. If you think this was bad, wait until you hear what my loving sister did with my inheritance. That's a story for tomorrow.